I'm Joe Lex, a retired professor of emergency medicine and a very amateur cemetery historian since I retired a few years ago. I've fallen in love with Laurel Hill Cemetery, founded in 1836 in Philadelphia, and West Laurel Hill Cemetery, founded in 1869 in Bala Cynwyd. They're just across the Schuylkill River from each other. For the last year or so, I do a monthly podcast called All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, which you can find wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Occasionally, I'll do a podcast about an artist, and I'll get frustrated when I can't show you their work. Same with architects. And when I first discovered the Frost family, I knew that I could not do them justice without using visuals. So welcome to the first of what I hope to be several podcasts about people at these two historic cemeteries. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, special YouTube edition, The Frost Family. They're in Section C, Lot 63, just a couple of 100 feet from the gatehouse. John Frost was born in Kennebunk, Maine in 1800 to Captain Nathaniel Frost and Abigail Kemble Frost. He was descended from Nicholas Frost, who first came to America in 1632. After a year at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, he graduated from Harvard College in 1822, and he took a job as headmaster at the Mayhew School in Boston from 1823 to 1827. He then moved to Philadelphia and became headmaster of a school for young ladies. On May 4, 1830, he married Sarah Ann Burdett, 1809 to 1882. She was from Boston. They married at her church, the Second Church Unitarian in Boston, and the minister, Ralph Waldo Emerson, conducted the ceremony. In 1838, John was one of the inaugural 8 instructors at Central High School in Philadelphia, which had just opened midway between Market and Clover on Juniper Street. It's now the site of the Wanamaker Building. He was a professor of belles lettres, fine writing. This is Central High School in 1839, shortly after it opened. This is also the first photograph in the United States. This daguerreotype was taken by someone who had just found out about daguerreotypes from France and wanted to try it himself. So this is an historically important photograph. Because of his success at the high school, he received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Marshall College in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. Mercersburg is named after Dr. Hugh Mercer, who is buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery, Section G, Plot 121. He got this honorary degree in 1843. Marshall College merged with Franklin College in 1849. Their motto is Lux et Lex, light and law. His first book, a composition class book of American literature, was published in 1826 in Boston. For 1 year, from September of 1841 to August of 42, he was editor of a popular magazine called The Young People's Book. Now, that's not to be confused with The Young People's Magazine. It was edited by himself and T.S. Arthur, 1809 to 1885, who's buried over at Woodland Cemetery. His publisher was Morton McMichael, 1807 to 1879, buried at Laurel Hill, Section H, Lot 45. They published it from 57 South 3rd Street. If you can't make it to the cemetery to visit Morton McMichael, then head to Lemon Hill. He has a statue there in Fairmount Park. I'm sure if you are a walker or a biker, you have passed it several times. His printers were the brothers, T.K. Collins and P.G. Collins. They're both buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery, Section K, lots 13, 14, and 16, right next to the Collins family mausoleum. Their print shop was on a street between Market and Chestnut, 7th and 8th. I believe it is now a narrow connection of Wrenstead Street. The Young People's Book was a 32-page monthly, quote, devoted to the instruction and entertainment of young persons of both sexes, conducted with a sole view to their improvement in literature, science, and the conduct of life, written not in the colloquial language which is addressed to very young children, but with such attention to the style as shall render it worthy the notice of those who are acquiring the art of composition or forming their literary taste. Unquote. It got very good reviews from Godey's Lady's Book, the North American Review, the New York Mirror, and many other publications, but it went out of business after just 1 year. In addition to being an educator, Frost was a prolific writer. He wrote many textbooks that proved popular, including Frost's Practical Grammar in 1842, Pictorial Life of Andrew Jackson in 1845, Pictorial History of the World, Great Events in Modern History, Thrilling Adventures Among the Indians. This came out in 1853. Heroic Women of the West, 1854. The Life of Empress Josephine, and many, many more. It's like he was the Isaac Asimov of the 19th century. Now, a complete list would take about 70 slides, since he wrote more than 300 books. And he didn't always use his own name. Sometimes he wrote as Robert Ramble, The Birds of the Air, and Stories from the History of Greece. Other times he wrote as William V. Moore, Indian Wars of the United States, Pictorial Life of Napoleon Bonaparte. All of these were good sellers at the time. This is why there is a book on top of his tombstone. For a while, he was also an assistant editor at Godey's Lady's Book under Sarah Josepha Hale, the editress. That's her word. She's buried at Laurel Hill Section X, Lot 61. Louis Godey, the publisher of Godey's Lady's Book, is buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery also, in Section WXYZ Oval. He made a very good living as a writer. John Frost died at age 59 on December 28, 1859. Sarah outlived him by more than 2 decades. Their daughter, Sarah Annie Burdett Frost, 1837 to 1882, also buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery, was named after her mother. She was the 4th oldest child. She married Captain William Shields on February 7, 1866, and she was also an author. Her most notable work was Almost a Man. It was published in 1877 under the name S. Annie Frost, and it was illustrated by her brother Arthur. This is the frontispiece from Almost a Man by S. Annie Frost with illustrations by Arthur Burdett Frost. Charles William Frost, who lived from 1848 to 1939, he's buried at Woodland Cemetery, though. He was a drummer boy training for the front when the Civil War ended. He acted as an advertising agent for many years and eventually purchased Godey's Lady's Book late in its publication run. Under the pseudonym of C.S. Kemble, he wrote a book called Wasted Sweetness in 1875, which was illustrated by his brother, Arthur Burdett Frost. George Frederic Frost, 1839 to 1864, was another of the 10 children born to John and Sarah in Philadelphia. I can find nothing about his education or upbringing. We do know that he was a Civil War Union Army officer. He was commissioned as a first lieutenant in Company B, 115th United States Colored Infantry on August 22, 1864. It did not last long. He died of what was probably typhoid fever at Bowling Green, Kentucky, about a month after he was given this position. And now we come to Arthur Burdett Frost, better known as A.B. Frost, born on January 17, 1851, when his father was 50 and his mother was 41. He was the ninth of 10 children, only 2 of whom survived beyond his teenage years, Sarah and Charles. A.B. was 12 when his brother George died, and he was only 8 when his father died. A.B. Frost was 15 years old when he started work with a wood engraver. Later, he worked in the office of a lithographer. He sketched in the evenings, and he studied for a while under Thomas Eakins at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Later in life, he had his portrait done in oils by Thomas Eakins. At one point, Frost actually became a model for Eakins, who got into trouble at PAFA for using nude models and for some of his nude paintings. In this, one of Eakins' most famous works, The Swimming Hole from 1884 to 1885, the redhead standing by the rock thigh deep is A.B. Frost, and the older gentleman swimming toward him is Thomas Eakins. In 1874, Frost was a struggling 23-year-old lithographer when a friend of his recommended him to his brother, Charles Eber Clark, who's buried at Montgomery Cemetery in Norristown. Clark was writing a book called Out of the Hurly Burly, or Life in an Odd Corner, using the pen name Max Adler. When the book came out in 1874, it contained nearly 400 illustrations, almost all by the young A.B. Frost. It was a smashing success. It sold more than 1 million copies. This is A.B. Frost's style. You see his signature in the bottom right-hand corner. When you look at the facial expressions, when you look at the expressions on the faces of the animals, when you look at the caricature, you begin to think, that is A.B. Frost. Here are some other examples of Frost's drawings from Out of the Hurly Burly. First of all, there are his initials down at the bottom. A lot of this looks like standard lithography, which you'd find in practically any book of those days. But what makes it look like Frost is when you start seeing these facial expressions. This may be the most predictive of Frost's future. It is somebody dreaming of horses, but he has perfected motion, perfected drawing motion in cartoon form. So it's a combination of caricature, like this, and motion that is so typical of A.B. Frost. In 1876, Frost was hired by Harper and Brothers Publishing House. 1880 to 1910 was called appropriately the Golden Age of American illustration. And this Harper and Brothers syndicate employed some of the decade's most prolific artists, including this guy, E.W. Kemble, from 1861 to 1933. Frederic Remington was another of the illustrators used by Harper and Brothers. If you are in Philadelphia, you know Frederic Remington. You pass this statue on Kelly Drive, and if you look down here, the next time you're on foot, go find Remington's signature. It's right there. There's one similar to this that sits in the Oval Office that's been there for years and years. C.S. Reinhardt was another one of the illustrators. Here we see an example again from Harper's Weekly. Howard Pyle might have been the most famous artist other than A.B. Frost. Frost and Pyle became such good friends that the former actually served as the best man at the latter's 1881 wedding. Frost would go on to publish illustrations for Harper's Weekly, Punch, Scribner's, and even Life magazine, which started publishing in 1883. Now, while he was studying in London in 1878, he received a letter from this guy, C.L. Dodgson, also known as Lewis Carroll. This photo, by the way, was taken by Frost, and it's in the Rosenbach collection in Philadelphia. Frost's signature is on the back. I took a picture of it, but I couldn't find it. This is what actually got me interested in A.B. Frost, is when I went on a Lewis Carroll tour at the Rosenbach collection on Delancey Street in Philadelphia. Anyway, Lewis Carroll said, would you be interested in illustrating a book that I have coming out that I'm putting together right now? He had had a falling out with his former illustrator, John Tenniel, the guy who illustrated the classic Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865 and Through the Looking Glass in 1872. He had seen Frost's work in a London newspaper. This is Judy, the London Serio-Comic Journal. I have to assume that Judy is part of the Punch but I don't know that for certain. Again, movement. This is so typical of Frost. This is what Lewis Carroll was looking for his new book. The book did not come out until 1883. It's called Rhyme and Reason, each with a question mark. The original manuscript of this and 54 of the original drawings are in the Rosenbach collection by Lewis Carroll. 65 illustrations by Arthur B. Frost. Frost did not necessarily want to do more work with Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll would do things like saying, this is what I want this character to look like, and he would send him an illustration. And then Frost would have to do the final drawing based on Lewis Carroll's illustration. That might be my favorite from the book. He came back to Philadelphia, opened a studio at 1330 Chestnut Street, and then he plunged into illustrations for this book, Random Shots. This is his third book with Max Adler, the guy who did Out of the Hurly Burly. In 1878, while he was studying at PAFA, he became familiar with the photographic experiments of Edouard Muybridge. This is what inspired him to publish his first sequential stories, what would now be considered comic books or comic strips. They were not the first comic strips, but they were some of the first that people in the United States paid attention to. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of those in a minute or two. He also met Emily Louis Levis Phillips, born in January of 1852, who had studied art in Germany and was herself a professional artist. In 1883, Arthur and Emily shared a commission for the book New England Bygones. It was by Ellen Chapman Hobbs Rollins, writing under the pen name of E.H.R. Arthur and Emily were married on October 19, 1883, and they took up residence on Long Island. They left the studio on Chestnut Street behind, and Thomas Eakins immediately moved in. In 1884, he supplied 5 illustrations for Theodore Roosevelt's Hunting Trips of a Ranchman. Also in 1884, he published the first work under his own name, Stuff and Nonsense, by A.B. Frost. It was so successful that a second edition was released 3 years later. This book contained one of his best-known series of drawings. This strip was called Our Cat Takes Rat Poison. Later editions, it was called The Fatal Mistake, A Tale of a Cat, but almost everybody knows it as Our Cat Takes Rat Poison. Here you are going to see development of A.B. Frost's in-movement style. It's all very calm. The cat eats, Cat starts to feel some pain in the stomach. You can see the paw come across the front. And there we go. The action drawing in this is fabulous. And the facial expressions. "1884, The Fatal Mistake, A Tale of a Cat," illustrations from Stuff and Nonsense. Here's another example of his style. This one emphasizes facial expressions a lot more than movement, although you will see some movement, some motion in this. It's called Style. It's from the 1891 Scribner's magazine, and it is an artist who is inviting his instructor to come evaluate one of his latest pieces. Let's see if you can figure out what's going to happen here. He makes the mistake of handing his instructor the palette. You know what's going to happen next. He realizes his mistake. This still makes me laugh. I've probably seen it 20 or 30 times, and I feel his pain. There, that's the way it should look. And here is our poor subject. I love it. Don't bother to thank me. He published more books under his own name. Another one that was very popular was The Bull Calf and Other Tales by A.B. Frost. Again, the motion. In this particular strip, the bust on the shelf changes facial expressions depending on the action in each individual panel. This is a book of drawings that was released in 1904. As you can see, this is a lot more formal, and you might not automatically assume that those were A.B. Frost pictures. They aren't as distinctive as the comic strip style that he was doing. Joel Chandler Harris approached him and asked if he would like to do illustrations for Uncle Remus, his songs and his sayings. He accepted, and when Uncle Remus was reissued in 1911, new and revised edition with 112 illustrations by A.B. Frost. This may have been some of the best stuff that he ever did. Here we see a sketch of Brer Fox with a note from Frost to, I'm not sure who that's to. I think it's just an illustration he did. But then look at how good Brer Rabbit is talking to the tar baby here. Look at the quality of that drawing. And then look at the watercolor of Brer Rabbit standing there with his pipe. That is just absolutely gorgeous. Again, we see more action with Brer Rabbit riding Brer Fox. Here's Carlo from 1912. Carlo was a dog that A.B. Frost wrote much about. It was even translated into other languages. That is a happy dog. And that is an angry dog. In addition to his illustrations, Frost became a fine artist in watercolors, especially of sporting prints. They remain very highly sought after among collectors. In 2015, at an auction in South Carolina, Arthur Burdett Frost's 14-inch by 22-inch 1895 watercolor called Quail, A Covey Rise sold for $180,000. The previous record for an A.B. Frost work was set on October 15, 1989. Autumn woodcock shooting sold for $85,250. There are many, many Frost watercolors which are highly sought by collectors. They were even used by various corporations to advertise their wares. These 1899 and 1900 calendars from Winchester Repeating Arms shows you. Frost and his wife spent their most productive years at a country home in Convent Station, New Jersey, which they named Money Sunk. Two of their sons grew up to be artists. A.B. Frost taught them the rudiments of art, and both of them became successful, Arthur Burdett Frost Jr. and John or Jack Frost. Arthur Burdett Frost Jr. was born on December 13, 1887. He studied in America under William M. Chase and Robert Henri until 1906, when he went abroad and studied at the Académie Julian in Paris. He painted at first in the Impressionistic school. In 1907, he began studying under Henri Matisse, remaining throughout that year. He returned to the United States around 1915 or 1916 and opened a studio in New York City. He painted his father at his easel around 1915. Unfortunately, he contracted tuberculosis. He died suddenly on December 7, 1917, 6 days shy of his 30th birthday and unmarried. I looked and I could not find his burial site. The youngest son, John Jack Frost, also studied art in Paris. He suffered from poor health through much of his life, and as a young adult, he spent 2 years in a tuberculosis sanitarium in Switzerland. But after becoming a successful illustrator in New York City, he moved out west seeking a dry climate for his health. Jack married Priscilla G. Morgridge in 1922, and after they honeymooned in Santa Barbara, he settled with his new wife in Pasadena, California. He started painting the local landscape, and he became famous for his scenic paintings. He also painted a portrait of his father. Now this work, spring 1926, sold for $269,000 in 2013. He also has had many retrospectives at museums, especially out west, since that's what he specialized in. Jack died on June 5, 1937, at age 47. He and his wife are also buried in the family plot. A.B. and Sarah moved to Paris in 1908. They returned in 1916 to settle in Wayne, Pennsylvania until 1924. That's when they joined Jack in Pasadena. Arthur Burdett Frost died in his sleep on June 22, 1928. He was 77 years old. His tombstone is melting. I took this picture about 2 days before I recorded this, and I had a hard time making out the letters. So that is the first of these video casts that I've done for Laurel Hill Cemetery, West Laurel Hill Cemetery. I invite you, check out my podcast, All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, wherever you find your podcasts. If you enjoy it, let me know. @JoeLex5 is my Twitter handle. Joe@joelex.net is my email address. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any suggestions for artists or architects or sculptors who are buried at Laurel Hill or West Laurel Hill, and you'd like me to do a video on them, also let me know. I'll be happy to take them into consideration. Stay safe, stay well. This is Dr. Joe Lex for All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories.